On March 9, 1945, high over Ulithi Atoll in the western Carolines at 28,000 feet, Lieutenant Miki Takuma kept his face close to the camera window of his Nakajima C6N Saiun reconnaissance plane. He felt the frigid glass on his oxygen mask while the camera shutter activated repeatedly. Beneath him, filling a turquoise lagoon comparable in size to Manhattan, was evidence that the Imperial Japanese Navy's core assumptions regarding American carrier operations were devastatingly incorrect. Silver hulls were arrayed in orderly rows, resembling city blocks. Their flight decks shone in the midday light. Geometric patterns of oil streaks marked the water. On the steel planks, deck crews resembled moving match heads. Takuma made his count, and then he verified it. In total, 15 flat tops, 6 fleet carriers, and 9 escort carriers were anchored together in a location presumed vulnerable. The Japanese had believed it was far too exposed for a concentration of capital ships. His hand shook while replacing the film magazine. This had transcended reconnaissance. This was the paperwork of failure. What nobody realized, not Takuma capturing images of the impossible armada, not the officers who would analyze his pictures, nor even Admiral Somu Toyoda directing the combined fleet from Japan, was that this instant signified the end of Japanese naval strategy. The concept of a decisive battle, the trust in special attack units, the assumption that U.S. carriers were few and dispersed following the Philippine Sea and Leyte, all of it evaporated within the chemical emulsion of the recon film. Before that film even arrived in Tokyo, 24 twin-engine bombers were being readied for a hopeless long-distance attack that would hardly damage the floating city. The arithmetic of industrial conflict was already established. Japan just hadn't yet grasped the full equation. The Imperial Japanese Navy began 1945 by clinging to a fragmented operational doctrine conceived when carrier fleets were small, precious, and exposed. Combined Fleet Headquarters persisted in speaking of initiating a decisive fight, of luring American carriers into kill zones for special attack units to cripple them. This strategy presupposed scarcity on the American side, that the losses at the Philippine Sea in June 1944 and Leyte Gulf in October had forced the U.S. Navy to protect its remaining carriers, employ them with caution, and base them far from combat zones where Japanese long-range attacks might find them anchored. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, directing the combined fleet from Hiyoshi near Tokyo, had based his entire operational framework on this supposition. In a post-war interrogation, he would affirm clearly that the primary target of the Navy's special attack units was American aircraft carriers. Everything hinged on the destruction or crippling of those carriers. Without them, the American offensive would halt. With them intact and functioning, Japan would face a certain defeat. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, leading the 5th Air Fleet and organizing the kamikaze operations that started in desperation at Leyte, held this same fixation. His diary notations from early 1945 demonstrated total confidence that focused suicide attacks could disable American carrier task forces. The Americans might possess industrial might, but they couldn't quickly replace skilled carrier crews. They couldn't maintain the operational pace forever. Their supply lines had to be vulnerable. Their forward staging areas had to be exposed. This conviction was not illogical, considering Japan's own experience. Japan's own fuel deficits had kept much of its fleet immobilized. Pilot casualties had wrecked its air groups. Ship damage necessitated lengthy repair stays in faraway yards. Japanese officers projected their own limitations onto their foe, presuming America must also endure similar operational lulls following major engagements. The notion that the United States could concentrate over 15 carriers at a forward anchorage merely 300 miles from Japan itself seemed strategically beyond belief. The initial sign that these assumptions were perilously flawed appeared on November 16, 1944. A C-6N reconnaissance plane flew over Ulithi, reporting 4 fleet carriers moored there. This by itself was startling. Ulithi, a coral atoll in the Western Carolines, had been taken by U.S. troops without opposition on September 23rd. While intelligence noted it as a fleet anchorage, the Japanese presumed its use was for support craft and auxiliaries, not for capital ships. Anchoring carriers at Ulithi was strategically nonsensical according to Japanese doctrine. The lagoon was positioned too far forward, too unprotected, too susceptible to attack. 4 days later, on November 20th, submarines I-47 and I-36 deployed Chiton-manned torpedoes against vessels in Ulithi Lagoon. One Chiton impacted the fleet oiler USS Mississiniwa, igniting her cargo in a colossal fireball that claimed 63 sailors' lives and sank the vessel in minutes. Tokyo got reports that credited the sinking of multiple carriers. This overclaim wasn't intentional deceit, but rather a hopeful reading of sparse data. The success bolstered the Chiton program and obscured the more significant truth captured in reconnaissance photos. The Americans were using Ulithi like a secure bastion, not a high-risk anchorage. On December 8, 1944, a U.S. Navy photographer took a picture that would become a defining symbol of American carrier mass production. Photo 80G294131 depicted 5 Essex-class carriers anchored side by side at Ulithi. Wasp, Yorktown, Hornet, Hancock, and Ticonderoga were aligned like apartment blocks, their flight decks in parallel, their islands forming a repeating silhouette against the lagoon. The image was captioned, "Murderer's Row," a title that communicated both pride and menace. For Japanese intelligence analysts who later viewed copies, the photograph was profoundly unsettling. Carriers docked so closely, so nonchalantly, implied an adversary that felt no danger from Japanese offensive capabilities. The magnitude of American operations from Ulithi was becoming impossible to overlook. On February 10, 1945, Task Force 58, led by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, sortied from the atoll heading for Japan, with radio misdirection hiding the departure until the carriers were well at sea. The very fact that such a fleet could gather, refuel, rearm, and sortie from a lagoon that was empty jungle 6 months prior showed a logistical power Japan could not hope to equal. Service Squadron 10 had converted Ulithi into a mobile Navy yard, featuring repair ships, floating dry docks, ammunition barges, refrigerated food vessels, and hospital ships. The lagoon was capable of servicing hundreds of vessels at once, reducing complex maintenance that would take weeks in Pearl Harbor to mere days at anchor in the Western Pacific. By early March 1945, Japanese reconnaissance was aware that an unprecedented force was amassing at Ulithi. The photographic missions were stepped up. On March 5th, a C6N overflight tallied 16 carriers at anchor. This figure surpassed anything in Japanese strategic projections. 16 carriers signified more than just a number. It signified task groups capable of rotating on station, enabling continuous operations. It signified a repair capability that could mend battle damage on site. It signified logistics that could maintain an indefinite tempo. Most unnervingly, it signified that even after the Philippine Sea and Leyte, even after months of non-stop combat, the American carrier fleet was not shrinking, but expanding. 4 days later, on March 9th, Lieutenant Miki Takuma departed for what would be the definitive reconnaissance flight over Ulithi. His observer, Warrant Officer Ito Kunio, handled the cameras as the C6N circled at an extreme altitude, safely above the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. The photos they returned with revealed 6 fleet carriers and 9 escort carriers, 15 flat tops within a single lagoon. The images were perfectly clear, offering no possibility of misidentification. The carriers were not damaged hulks awaiting service. They were fully functional vessels, their decks packed with aircraft, their crews plainly visible on enlarged prints. The photographs arrived on desks at combined fleet headquarters, resembling documentary proof presented at a trial. Staff officers examined them with magnifying glasses, tallying aircraft on decks, recognizing specific carrier classes, and estimating the distance between ships. The deduction was unavoidable. The United States had accomplished something the Imperial Japanese Navy had never achieved, even at its zenith: an operational concentration of carriers. This force could sortie as one fleet, operate for weeks without needing to return to distant bases, and replace its losses faster than combat could inflict them. The reaction was Operation Tan No. 2, a last-ditch, long-range attack aimed at disabling the anchorage before those carriers could sortie once more. Vice Admiral Ugaki assembled 24 Yokosuka P-1Y Francis twin-engine bombers, modified them for kamikaze roles with 800-kilo bombs, and briefed the pilots on a mission that would stretch their aircraft to their absolute range. 6 Kawanishi H-8K Emily flying boats were tasked with providing navigation aid and weather reconnaissance. The attack was set for maximum surprise, timed for a dusk arrival when the American Combat Air Patrol would be in transition. The plan was tactically viable, but strategically irrelevant. Even if all aircraft made it to Ulithi and struck a carrier, sinking or damaging a few ships from a fleet of 15 would not alter the operational equation. The Americans would just move up replacements from Pearl Harbor or even from the West Coast. But Japanese naval aviation was now limited to tactical gestures. No strategic possibilities remained, only different forms of sacrifice. On March 11, 1945, the Azusa unit took off from Kanoya Airfield on Kyushu. The P-1Y bombers, weighed down with fuel and bombs, labored into the sky and gathered over the East China Sea. Navigating to Ulithi meant flying 300 miles across open ocean with few navigational aids. The tolerance for error was non-existent. Fuel was rationed to the final liter. No allowance was made for combat maneuvers or weather detours. Attrition started right away. 2 planes reversed course with engine trouble. 3 became separated in clouds and never regrouped. 4 ran short on fuel and had to ditch before reaching Ulithi. Another 6 were shot down by the American Combat Air Patrol, which intercepted the group 150 miles from the atoll. The Emily flying boats, slow and exposed, were decimated. Only 2 P-1Y bombers made it to Ulithi itself, arriving at dusk as intended, but they found the anchorage on high alert and defended. One kamikaze pilot, his identity unknown to history, singled out the Essex-class carrier USS Randolph anchored in the lagoon. He forced his plane into a diving attack, dodging anti-aircraft fire with sharp maneuvers that burned his last fuel. The P-1Y hit Randolph's stern, punching through the flight deck and exploding in the crew's quarters below. The explosion killed 26 sailors and injured 105 more. Fires burned across 3 decks before damage control crews could get them contained. For the Japanese aircrew who did not return, it might have seemed a victory. For combined fleet headquarters, processing initial reports, it briefly looked as if the desperate gamble had paid off. But for the American Navy, Randolph's damage was a fleeting setback. The carrier was fixed at Ulithi by mobile repair crews within 4 days. She sortied with Task Force 58 on March 14th, taking part in the strikes on Japan that the Tan No. 2 operation was meant to stop. The operational outcome was bleak. Japan expended 40 aircraft and over 100 aircrew to damage 1 carrier for 4 days. The United States repaired that carrier at a forward base, never disrupting the task force's schedule. The arithmetic was devastating. Given this exchange rate, Japan was destined to exhaust its supply of planes and pilots long before America exhausted its supply of carriers. On March 14, 1945, Task Force 58 sortied from Ulithi with 4 task groups, including the very carriers Lieutenant Takuma had photographed just 5 days prior. The official action report from Vice Admiral Mitcher detailed continuous operations lasting through late May. The task force hit airfields on Kyushu, shelled installations in the inland sea, provided support for the Okinawa landings starting March 23rd, and kept a combat air patrol over the invasion beaches for weeks. Resupply happened every 4 days. with task groups rotating on a schedule that ensured at least 2 groups were on station constantly. The operational pace was mechanical, unceasing, industrial. A British liaison officer, who was aboard one of the carriers for the first replenishment, officially noted that it was during this period he became fully aware of the versatility, power, and efficiency of the United States Pacific Fleet. This remark, hidden in official files, captured an outsider's view on what American planners saw as routine operations. To British sensibilities, familiar with the limitations of scarce resources and long supply lines, the American capacity to sustain high-tempo carrier operations from a forward anchorage was almost baffling. For Japanese commanders, the situation was worse than baffling. It was impossible to oppose. Vice Admiral Ugaki's diary entries from March and April 1945 reveal a shift from confidence to cognitive dissonance, and finally to a reluctant acceptance. He kept organizing mass kamikaze attacks, the Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum operations that would send hundreds of suicide planes against the American fleet off Okinawa. His diary frequently exaggerated the damage from these attacks, reporting carriers sunk that were only damaged or missed. But the fundamental reality bled through even his hopeful evaluations. The carriers persisted. Task Force 58 held its position regardless of what Japan threw at it. The sheer scale of American carrier operations during the Okinawa campaign, from April to June 1945, proved the transformation that Ulithi had made possible. The statistics compiled in Mitcher's action reports revealed a fleet working at a pace that would have been unattainable from Pearl Harbor or even from forward bases in the Philippines. From March 14th through May 28th, Task Force 58 was constantly either at sea or at Ulithi. The task group cycled through replenishment every 4 days without lowering the number of carriers on station. Combat air patrol flew from sunrise to sunset every single day. Strike groups of over 100 planes were launched against Japanese airfields, kamikaze staging areas, and remaining naval units. The kamikaze attacks did achieve tactical victories. Individual carriers were hit, sometimes badly, but none were sunk either at Ulithi or in the seas off Okinawa. The combination of radar picket destroyers, combat air patrol, and the carrier's own anti-aircraft defenses formed a protective shield that made successful hits extremely hard to achieve. More significantly, damaged carriers could be fixed. The fleet train had repair ships with mobile machine shops, floating dry docks capable of lifting vessels up to cruiser size, and damage control specialists who had handled every kind of battle damage. Carriers that would have needed months in U.S. yards were patched up and sent back to action in weeks or even days. The industrial power that supported this operational pace was evident in the figures. Essex-class carriers, the core of the Fast Carrier Task Force, totaled 24 commissioned during and just after the war. These weren't pre-war ships finally entering service, but vessels designed, constructed, and commissioned in wartime, each taking 2 years from keel laying to commissioning. The shipyards were turning out fleet carriers at a rate of 1 monthly during peak output. 9 Independence-class light carriers built on cruiser hulls offered extra capacity. In all, the U.S. Navy commissioned 33 fleet and light carriers during the war. Not all were in the Pacific simultaneously, but enough were on hand that Task Force 58 could typically operate with 15 or more carriers. When Admiral Raymond Spruance took 5th Fleet out for the Okinawa operation, the order of battle listed 29 carriers of all classes, 15 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 106 destroyers. This fleet, bigger than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy at its peak, sortied from Ulithi and maintained operations for months. For Japanese planners, who started the war assuming near parity in carrier strength, the photos of 15 carriers at Ulithi were the visible confirmation of their defeat. The United States hadn't just replaced its Pearl Harbor losses. It had constructed a carrier force larger than all other combatant navies combined. More importantly, It had created the logistics network to keep that force operating indefinitely, far from its home waters. The C6N reconnaissance planes that photographed this fleet were, themselves, proof of Japan's industrial decline. The Nakajima C6N Saiun was a superior design, fast enough to dodge most interceptors and capable of long-range photo recon missions, yet Japan produced only 463 of them through the entire war. The reconnaissance flights over Ulithi were some of the most critical intelligence-gathering missions of the war, yet they could only be flown intermittently because sufficient aircraft and trained crews were simply unavailable. In contrast, American photo reconnaissance was widespread and methodical. Every major Japanese base was photographed on a weekly or even daily basis. The pictures were processed, analyzed, and given to planning staffs in hours. Intelligence officers could monitor individual ships, count planes on airfields, and gauge bomb damage with an accuracy that Japanese intelligence could only dream of. This systematic method of reconnaissance was, itself, a result of industrial might. America had the luxury of dedicating whole squadrons to photo reconnaissance because it had planes to spare. The psychological effect on Japanese naval officers who grasped these realities was immense. Admiral Toyota kept issuing directives that stressed carriers were the main target for special attack units. But the orders began to sound desperate. After Ulithi, after the photos showing 15 carriers anchored casually together, the delusion that Japan could sink or cripple enough carriers to matter strategically became more difficult to sustain. The final realization didn't come in March 1945, but slowly over the spring and summer as Task Force 58 operated non-stop despite everything Japan did. The Kikusui mass attacks off Okinawa, some using over 300 planes, damaged carriers but failed to make them withdraw. Damaged carriers simply pulled back to Ulithi, were fixed by Service Squadron 10, and went back to the fight. The cycle repeated itself. For every carrier damaged, 2 more showed up from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast. The math was unavoidable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, plans were in place for Operation Arashi and Operation Hikari, more long-range reconnaissance and attack missions against Ulithi. The planning documents found after the surrender revealed that Japanese naval aviation still saw the carrier anchorage as the vital target, but the plans also implicitly conceded that Japan had never solved its carrier problem. The core of American naval power stayed intact and largely unharmed. The post-war questioning of Admiral Toyota gave the clearest summary of this reality. When asked about the goals of the special attack units, he answered simply that the principal objective was American aircraft carriers. The wording was significant, not destroying American carriers, not sinking them, but just identifying them as objectives. The gulf between the objective and the result was the measure of Japan's defeat. The tale of Ulithi and the 15 carriers that Lieutenant Takuma photographed is, in the end, about naval warfare's shift from a competition of tactical prowess to a display of industrial might. The Imperial Japanese Navy started the war with some of the best ships, most skilled pilots, and most seasoned commanders globally. It had studied carrier operations longer than any navy besides Britain's. Its doctrine was solid, its hardware was superb, its tactical execution often masterful. But none of that was decisive against a foe who could build carriers faster than they could be sunk, train pilots faster than they could be killed, and set up forward bases with repair capabilities that rivaled home front shipyards. The photos of Ulithi displayed this fact in a way no amount of propaganda could hide. Those 15 carriers, anchored in neat lines like items on a production line, were not the sum of American naval power. They were just the part that was currently resting between operations. The technical feat that Ulithi itself represented was staggering. Service Squadron 10 converted a coral atoll with zero infrastructure into a port that could manage over 700 ships at once. The squadron had repair ships like USS Ajax and USS Hector carrying full machine shops. Floating dry docks like ABSD-2 could lift destroyers completely from the water for hull work. Ammunition ships moved thousands of tons of ordnance. Oilers pumped hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel. Refrigerated ships delivered fresh food to crews who had been at sea for months. The whole system ran with an industrial efficiency that changed combat logistics from a constraint into an enabler. Japanese naval planners had figured that American carriers would have to go back to Pearl Harbor or the West Coast for major repairs and resupply. This assumption, factored into their strategic calculations, allowed Japan time between U.S. offensives to recover strength and ready defenses. Ulithi nullified that assumption. Carriers could be maintained, fixed, and rearmed without ever departing the Western Pacific. The operational pace this allowed was something Japan couldn't equal, even at its peak. The human element of this shift is often obscured by statistics on ship production and sortie rates. The sailors who serviced those carriers at Ulithi toiled around the clock in tropical heat, moving ammunition and aviation fuel in conditions that would halt peacetime work. The pilots flying from those carriers took off on missions, knowing that a mechanical issue over open water likely meant death. The damage control teams fighting fires and mending battle damage did so while under kamikaze assault, with their ships maneuvering sharply and explosions threatening to ignite fuel and ordnance. The Japanese air crew who flew against this armada demonstrated incredible bravery in a hopeless cause. The pilots of Operation Tan No. 2 were aware that reaching Ulithi meant flying at their absolute range limit with no room for error and almost no likelihood of return. They flew regardless, not out of fanaticism, but from a sense of duty that went beyond rational thought. Most perished in the ocean, their planes running out of fuel hundreds of miles from land. Some were downed by combat air patrol that radar had guided to intercept them long before they saw the target. Only 2 made it through, and their sacrifice impaired one carrier for 4 days. The imbalance was cruel, yet total. Japanese aircrew were dying by the hundreds, trying to hurt a fleet that could withstand their attacks and keep on fighting. American sailors died as well, 26 killed on Randolph alone, but the ship endured and the fleet continued. Industrial warfare demoted individual courage to a statistical element, significant at the tactical level, but insignificant to the strategic outcome. The 15 carriers at Ulithi symbolized more than just naval strength. They personified a system that combined industrial output, technical advancement, logistics planning, and operational doctrine into a single unified entity. Every part reinforced the others. Mass production of standard carriers simplified crew training because systems were identical on all ships. Standardization accelerated repairs because parts were interchangeable. Forward basing cut down transit time and permitted a faster operational pace. A faster pace meant more missions flown, more intelligence collected, and more enemy capabilities degraded. Japan had no counter to this system because matching it would have meant rebuilding Japanese industry and logistics from the ground up. Single components could be imitated. Japan constructed excellent carriers, trained proficient pilots, and devised sound tactics, but the integrated system that let America sustain carrier operations indefinitely from forward bases was beyond Japan as economic and industrial means to copy. The images Lieutenant Takuma returned with from Ulithi captured this new reality with absolute crystalline precision. Seeing 15 carriers at anchor was not witnessing a temporary buildup. It was observing a standard operational posture.